has a PhD in ACD. And, I think that's very fitting. I like to also thank him today. He taught me to double clutch the cord so I could downshift it properly, and I need a little more practice with that, but it's working out well. And appreciate your help with that. Randy hails from California, as many of you know, and been in the restoration business, and I think if I wrote that down right, and maybe I missed it, but maybe in 1965 he got his first Auburn. So without any further ado, Randy Eamer.
Good evening.
Good evening.
First of all, I didn't hear a big hand for all of you guys that volunteered and worked on this meeting, and I would like to. You obviously have all worked very hard, and you have crossed your T's and dotted your I's. It's been great, so thank you. I'm gonna weave a little tale. I'm gonna create a little drive road back into history, so be patient with me. I may wander off in this direction, wander off in that direction. If I don't get back to it, you might remind me, but if you wouldn't mind waiting until I'm all done, that would make it a little easier, Mike. So, yeah. Any heckling, you hear him, just, if I ignore him, I'm ignoring him for a reason, and I apologize, so. I think, and the more I thought about this, the more I am sure that I needed to start back at the beginning. So we're gonna go back all the way to Eckhart's and the founding of the Eckhart Carriage, and we're gonna go all the way through contemporary times almost. So if you don't mind, I'll spin this tale, but please wait until the end to ask any questions you might have, if you don't mind. So Charles Eckhart founded the Eckhart Carriage. He had two sons. So the two sons, like most sons, they wanted something a little more than a horse-drawn buggy, especially as the turn of the century came along. And in 1902, they actually bought an automobile. They went to Cleveland to buy a Winton, didn't have enough coin in their pocket to do it. They ended up going to Detroit. I think, from the description I can get, they bought an Oldsmobile. They brought it back and drove it back. It took them quite a while to get there at 20 miles an hour and dirt and mud. And they then decided that they could improve upon it, so they kept going. And they ended up buying an engine from a source. They built a frame. They were carriage builders, so they were able to build a body that would work. So Frank and Morris started officially in '02, but incorporated in '03, making Auburn automobiles. And I'll come back to this too. So the town is, like most small town, relies on philanthropy from the wealthy patrons in the town. And Auburn, Indiana has gotten a lot of things from Charles Eckhart. Charles Eckhart runs for Congress. He runs for governor of Indiana on a prohibition ticket. He actually takes, when they work on Sundays, he walks the guys down to church and brings them back, make sure they come back. And no cigarettes are allowed, no alcohol. You get caught drunk, you're fired. That changed too, but that's another story. So the town, by 1918, this town has been spoiled rotten by Charles Eckhart. Even though he's somewhat retired, failing, Morris and Frank, the sons, are still doing things for the community. They've given a library, they've given them a YMCA, they've given them a park in their name. So this community is now used to that. So along comes the Wrigleys, and it's Chicago First National Bank is Wrigley. That is big money, it's big business. They don't quite know how to react to it because they've lost their philanthropy, they've lost their in-town affair with a local leader. Wrigley, the company, continues to die. Slowly it's dying. They can see that not much change. They do a little few odds and ends. And by 1924, they actually discontinue and hire, buy Lycoming engines from Lycoming for the first time, free cord. So they finally, through Ralph Bard, has become aware of a salesman at Quinlan Motors in Chicago who is E.L. Cord. I'll start back with E.L. Cord now. This is where it may get difficult because I'm weaving here. E.L. Cord, born in Missouri, grows up in Santa Monica, California. His father died at a fairly young age, and his mother buys a boarding house in Santa Monica. So he was raised in LA area. He tries this, he tries that, he builds Model T Speedsters. He builds all sorts of different things at all sorts of different variety of ventures. He tries trucking, he tries busing, and ultimately when he is hired by Bard through Wrigley's approval and comes to Auburn, he has two very, very good traits. One, he has wonderful taste. He has an eye for design. He has an eye for horsepower to weight ratio construction. Two, he is a magnificent salesman. He is a very strict and very always adheres to his business pattern. You can almost follow what he does. So in comes Cord. The atmosphere changes. There is no longer any philanthropy. There is no longer any money going to this venture and that venture, and there becomes some degree of friction with this town, which is spoiled by it. So in 1926, early on, he has learned from a man by the name of Frank Vanderlip the practice of stock manipulation. And he's kind of learned how to get creative designs free, and he get creative engineering somewhat free. And he's developing that. It's all growing. He expands. He instantly, September 26th, he buys Duesenberg. But the main reason he bought Duesenberg is, and when he introduced mid-year 25, the new Auburns, he copied Molly Duesenberg. He copied it exactly. It's horsepower to weight ratio, the body designs, the radiator shell is almost the same thing. Lights are similar, bumpers are similar. The basic look of the car is modern, where the old car is still, the Eckharts. That design still goes back to the Eckharts. So this is what starts to grow. He instantly starts buying up companies. He buys Lycoming. That's the previous company head, Farley, started buying Lycoming engines. He starts following that path, and he starts going around through stock manipulation to buy all these different companies. So he's a little ruthless. He has a tendency to not pay attention to the little guy. He wants profits in his pocket, and he starts moving around buying up everything he can find. Central Body, Ansted, McFarland, Central Body later, as I mentioned, and he's buying all these things faster, and it's growing and growing. By the time 29, I think it's January of 29, he actually has recognized that he can't work in Auburn. Not only are city fathers not willing to hand him, the mayor is not handing him the keys very happily, and he starts, moving out of Auburn. The part of the problem is, prior in Auburn, next to the factory, off of Eckhart or Ensley Creek, it floods. So he doesn't have a way to really add on, because residents come up to the factory. The south side, it doesn't, but it is a floodplain. So it really doesn't have a place to build, and he cannot get permits to build, not easily. He has to fight with city fathers. He complained all the time about too many chiefs, not enough Indians in that town. Everybody knew what he was doing. Everybody, if you called Auburn, Indiana, and you wanted somebody, and they weren't home, the operator would tell you where they were. They're not home tonight, they're playing cards at so-and-so's house. So, it was that small of a community. This town came to him and said, hey, look, we can offer you, there was a consortium put together that owned most of the businesses and property in town, and purchase Ansted and all the other factories that Lexington and all that sort of stuff. So they came to him, this town opened their arms, said, yeah, sure, yeah, bring your business here. We've got room, we can expand, and he did. So that's part of what moved, even though he kept administration there until 35. He kept the drawings, he kept that sort of stuff there until 35. So backwards again, let's talk about Duesenberg briefly. So he has bought and he is controlling Duesenberg. He tells Fred Duesenberg, and that's the only time he actually met him, that he wants to build a supercar. Fred Duesenberg wanted to build a small, lightweight, Bugatti-ish type automobile, and that's what he kept doing prototypes with. Cord said, no, I want the biggest, the fastest, I want to go against the Bugatti Royale. I want big, fast, mean, and expensive. Even though it's a couple grand less than a Rolls at the time, it's big and it's fast and it's mean. They tried, he came out with a prototype of what they call the Model Y. It is all his engineering, but he works, actually Fred Duesenberg worked as an employee for all the companies except briefly one. He was just a chief engineer and his brother was the head mechanic or chief head fabricator. So finally the Model J is introduced. Augie, of course, was never hired. He goes off and wants to race and he plays racing from there on in. But it is Eocord who is totally the idea behind the Model J. Fred Duesenberg really wants nothing to do with it. So again, there's that taste of design, that taste of engineering that is so eminent in Eocord. And he actually goes to the shows and he actually helps sell, the New York Auto Show sells the car to the New Yorkers. First year they sold over 200 cars. And that was the end. It went down from there. So the L29 is introduced at the same time. That's Al Leamy, who was head of design there. Actually, Al Leamy came into Duesenberg and designed the sheet metal for the Model J. And then they sent it all to the coach builders. He still keeps buying. By 1931, he has a huge dealer network everywhere. And that helps. He's got Roy Faulkner as his sales manager who lives in Auburn. A lot of the Auburn executives still live there and grew up within the Auburn system, so that's why they're staying there. That's why headquarters is still there. But most of it after 29, except for engineering and management which is still in Auburn, is here. So he's moved his plant, he's moved his production. In 1931, I forget, in the early part of 31, there were 2,500 employees at Auburn Automobile Company. They built 32,000 cars. Now, that's up from 10,000 in 1930. And everybody else is through the floor. Ford, General Motors, everybody else, Willys, are all through the floor. And here, this little small startup company has this new model that's Leamy designed. They're using the latest and greatest thing from Lycoming in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, and they sell like hotcakes. But by September of 31, handwriting kind of comes up on the wall that things are dropping pretty rapidly. And in 32, it drops down a third in sales. But Cord's wife, by 31, passes away. She was back and forth to Wisconsin. What's the big hospital? Oh, well, immaterial. She dies. Cord kind of goes off the end, and he pretty much leaves LA, or leaves here, Auburn. Actually, he's in and out at this time. He's up in Detroit, he's up and spending a lot of time in Chicago, and he's buying now aviation companies. He's involved in not only aviation transportation, but Parmalee transportation. There's all sorts of things that he's bought into. I don't even have a complete list of all the things that he bought and sold over those years. Some failed, like his early days. I think he went through 60 different companies that he bought and tried and then failed. It was immense what was going on, but he went in all directions. So by 1932, he built a big mansion in Beverly Hills called Cord Haven. He's remarried. His second wife is Virginia. Helen has died. They have two sons, Charles and Billy. In fact, they called them At the factory, they called them string, and they called them string because they were little cords. So another problem happens. When is president installed? I forget. Is it January or?
January.
January.
Well, it was March until,
So it was March of 32, FDR is installed as president of the United States. And Cord campaigns, helps campaigns, sends him money, all those sort of things, because he's talking about all these great things to build America. Unfortunately, that turned on him, because first thing he did was turn around and hired the biggest document manipulator in the world, Joseph Kennedy, JFK's father, who was the biggest document manipulator there was, because he knew who was doing what and where. And Cord was in trouble. SEC started coming after him. He started going underground. So anything that happens after that point, Cord really isn't hands-on. Up to 32. The L-29 is absolutely his baby. The Auburn V-12 is absolutely his baby. Okay, another turn. Fred Duesenberg is chief engineer at this time for Auburn Automobile Company. Excuse me. 1929, we have Cord Corporation. This is the holding company that owns all this stuff. Chief engineer is Fred Duesenberg. He is actually tasked with working the details out of the front drive cord and actually mounts it, his Model A Duesenberg touring car body on the prototype to road test it and drive it around. He also develops a V16 front wheel drive for an L-29 cord. And this is an overhead valve 520 cubic inch V16, which they scaled down to a V12, which was 530, and then ultimately 399 for the Auburn. So the Auburn is introduced, and this will then start towards the trend of the baby Duesenberg. So I've made that circle. I'll go back. Now, Cord is in trouble, obviously in trouble. He claims that his children were threatened to be kidnapped. Now, his neighbor in LA, Edward Doheny, children were threatened to be kidnapped. But he has, I forget, Lucius Manning, his business associate, the two of them have two roughly 200-foot yachts. He jumps the yacht, heads down to the Panama Canal, and goes to England. And he's there through the early part of 35. He left the country. He had to leave the country because SEC was going to go after him big time. So he leaves the country. He pretty much puts Harold Ames and Beale, who was head of Lycoming, in charge. So after the development of this V12 and this V16, the factory starts working, and their Auburn sales have dropped off. Faulkner has left and gone to Pierce Arrow because, look at what a great job I did at Auburn. I can do that at Pierce Arrow. And I'm not sure he talked them into it or they talked him into making the move, but he went to Pierce Arrow. So then we talk about cords. So there are a million. Ames, Whitbeer, and others start developing, which probably Cord personally wouldn't have spent the money on, but they start developing. And in 32, prior to Fred's death, Lycoming develops a V8 engine. Now, first it came out in 31 as a FA series. It was just a flathead V8. It did not rev. It did not have much horsepower. Fred redesigned it. It's the same design. The rocker shaft interchanges with a Model A Duesenberg, an Auburn 12, and a Cord V8. They all work almost identical. It's the same idea. On an Auburn 12, it's an overhead valve. On this, it's a flathead. So Fred Duesenberg develops the Cord V8 engine. At this point, they don't know what they're going to do with it in 32, and of course, he dies in the summer of 32. So there's a big turnover here. With Fred Duesenberg's death, Duesenberg kind of goes down, and they start looking at ways to build a new Duesenberg, but a cheaper Duesenberg. They develop several different prototypes, some of which were actually built here and photographed here. There was a whole run of LeBaron bodies bought in 35 for a cheap Duesenberg. They were very expensive bodies. They ended up putting them on Cord chassis. There was a whole bunch of clay mock-ups. But ultimately, in 34, they built the baby Duesenberg. Gordon Burig designed it. It was built by A.H. Walker Company in Indianapolis. It was kind of Burig's baby in that the hood did not, you didn't have to open the hood to check the water or look at anything. It was a sealed unit. The radiators were between the fenders and the hood. Very much looked like what we call today the 810, 812. It used a Lycoming straight 8, a 34 Auburn chassis underneath it. They drove it, Burig and Denny Duesenberg, Fred Duesenberg's son, drove it from Indianapolis to Auburn, and they stopped every 10 miles to fill a radiator because it kept cracking as the fenders moved. So it got scrapped. So they're still working on, okay, what are we gonna replace it? Mainly because of stock. So E.O. Cord is in England at this time, staying clear of all this, even though he actually gets a cord fit and delivered to him in early part of 36, February or March, prior to actual production coming out. But so the first cord design, the fenders are Herb Newport. They added the crank up headlights. The early ones, the early prototypes folded up like such. And that is August Duesenberg. The interior lights are off the Walker coupe as the front fenders are, so they're Herb Newport designs. And the engine is actually designed by Fred Duesenberg, so thus the horsepower. Fred Duesenberg always believed in high-speed motors. Where else am I gonna, what other winding trail am I gonna read you on? I've probably left off a lot of hot details. I don't know how much longer you want me to sit here and talk, but what happens now is Cord management develops this 810, 812 Cord on a very tight budget. They spent under $1 million. They spent over $3 million developing and promoting the V12 Auburn. So it's not a serious venture to management and corporation. It's merely done to buy them time to sell out of their stock. Cord Corporation owns too much of Auburn Automobile Company. Auburn Automobile Company built the Cord. Auburn Automobile Company owned Duesenberg. But Cord Corporation owns all of these different companies by this time. So it becomes apparent that they have built a good product that looks good, and I will have to say, if it weren't for the people that were involved, Herb Snow, I mean, Lycoming builds the transmission cases, they do everything as cheap as they can to develop it. It's Detroit gears, but it's first Rosetta joints, it's the first Lockheed brakes. They do everything as cheap as they can in the beginning, tons of lead. They finally get a production car 3 months late. Sales, as we all know, is fairly lackluster. Enthusiasm is unreal, but sales drop off pretty fast. But it does buy management time to sell out. And by the time they've sold aviation and transportation, at the point they introduced the Cord, late 35, they owned like 28% of the stock of Auburn Auto Company. By the time they closed those doors and Aviation Transportation Company comes in, Auburn Automobile Company, they only own like 8% of the stock. Now, Cord, being of great wisdom, he's back by this time. Late 36, he comes back. They've kind of left him alone, and he stayed, from that point on, he stayed below the boards. He was very quiet what he was doing. He was always a third party. It was Harold Ames, or Beale, or Lucius Manning, who were the front men, or the attorney. Those were the front men. Cord was off the radar from there on out. So he actually, I shouldn't probably be telling the story. I was able to acquire all of Harold Ames' material too. And I have a receipt in there for a used 37 Lincoln Zephyr 2-door sedan. And they went around and hit all the bank accounts, pulled all the cash out, and then the two of them shifted and drove to California. So there was no money. So if you had stock in Auburn Automobile Company or Duesenberg, sorry, no money. It had no par value by the time they were through milking what was there and moved on, no par value. So it was pretty well devoid of anything. Of course, Aviation Transportation bought it. Aviation Transportation moved on and ultimately became Avco. And it is Cord who was still involved. Now, during this time, Cord develops property in Beverly Hills. He still owns. His foundation today donates $30 million to charitable trust every year, $30 million, because it's still making that much interest. Now, in the charitable trust field, that's not a ton, but sounds like a lot of money to me today, you know. But he ends up starting a little company called Central Pacific Airlines. That then becomes a little company called American Airways, and to manage the post office routes, he changes that to American Airlines. And as of his death, he was still the largest single stockholder in American Airlines. He was upon his death, he was one of the largest stockholders in Santa Fe Pacific Railway. He would get a hold of any idea where it looked like he could make money at it. He was buying Civil War scrip that was given to veterans to buy property, and he was trying to buy property out in the desert with that scrip. You know, he had more games and more, you know, more events going on. So he got into radio. I can't tell you how many different things. We really don't know. Julie and I were in Reno recently, and we went to there's an old building in Reno. It's not that old. It was modern, that he built at 200 Court Street. And inside the back door was a list about that long of all the different, because he developed the town of Arcadia, he developed Pacific Palisades. He had his fingers in every pie around. So this is one of many ventures that he had done and developed. But like I say, after 32, he's pretty much out of this part of it, and it's management that takes over. I think I've BS'd about as much as I can probably
I can listen all night.
Anybody have any questions, or did I already answer them all? Boy, you're an easy group. Wow. Nothing? Okay, thank you.
Something Connersville you can take back with you, a brick from the plant
Oh, wow. Oh, that's nice.
with a plaque on it, so.
Wow, that is really neat. Thank you.
Thank you for
Appreciate it.
coming to Connersville.
Thank you for putting it on. Appreciate it.